I'm going slow, so why don't we do introductions?
Okay.
John, are you ready?
Hello, yes, and the live stream just started, so happy for that. I have my lovely orchid right here. And I do love gardening. I have to get out in the garden. I am Sean Carroll with Tomeworks Editing, also the programming coordinator for Right Space Houston. And just got my copy of the HPAF Houston Poetry and Arts Festival. If not catalog, anthology from last year where I have a couple of poems in there. So yay, absolutely.
I'm Daphne Strasser. I'm also an editor with Tomeworks. I'm also a horror and romance writer, and the noise you hear in the background is my son. I specialize in horror and in romance, working with very visceral genres, but I work with all speculative fiction.
Um, I'm AP Hawkins or Anna Hawkins. Again, editor with Tomeworks. I specialize in science fiction and fantasy primarily. But obviously I'm open to editing all genres. I write science fiction and fantasy mostly. Um, I've had a few short stories published in anthologies and magazines, and I'm working on querying a novel right now. And working on finishing drafting another one very furiously at the moment. So,
I'm Ian. I'm Ian Everett. I also with Tomeworks. I do high fantasy, sci-fi, weird fantasy, or new weird as they call it these days. Horror. I'll edit anything. I'll be honest with you, but those are my preferences. And I am a web serial writer, so I've got the Megadrill series. The book one is fully out. You can read it at megadrillseries.com. And also I'll be at Axrad this Friday with Anna, I think.
oh, that's right. Yes,
Yeah.
we will be at Axelrad on
Yeah.
Friday for Right Space event.
Yeah.
For writerly games,
Yeah.
playing silly writer games, absolutely. I'm sure you guys will come up with awesome stuff. And then on Saturday for Writers Family Reunion, I'll be doing writing prompt bingo, and that's going to
Ooh,
be very interesting. What stories can you make out of tropes on a bingo card? And yeah, a little flash fiction exercise.
that'll be
That
fun.
sounds amazing.
So I'm Shannon Winton. I'm the last of the gaggle. I have been editing for over a decade, and I focus in on mostly science fiction and fantasy, but also mysteries and thrillers, whether or not they're speculative or not. I am a big fan of the Editorial Freelancers Association to the point where I am the Houston coordinator for the chapter. I also teach editors how to edit through the Editorial Freelancers Association. I am currently running the editing science fiction and fantasy class. It's a 6-week program where I teach other editors how to do their job.
Mhm.
So I do a lot of teaching. I love it, like with both writers and editors. It's a lot of fun for me when I'm not actually editing, which I am also currently doing. I have a deadline in 2 days that I am like deferring my work for this. But almost all of us here have said science fiction and fantasy. And one of the biggest things that sets science fiction and fantasy apart from many of the other contemporary genres that are out there is the amount and type of world building that has to be done for any books, even if they are, set in an Earth-like world, or even if they're set on Earth in contemporary times. The world building is still massive. So we get a lot of questions about like, how do I do things? Am I doing it right? Does it make sense? Have I gone too far? What's the difference between exposition and world building? Can I just throw this at the wall and see what sticks? That kind of thing. So that's what we're going to focus on today is a bunch of world building questions. If you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat, but we do have a pretty good number of questions from people already. So I'm going to start with basically a question that requires an introduction, and it's one of those things that the gamers will probably recognize as well. Is what is top-down or bottom-up world building? And then the follow-up question is, which one's better? So I'm gonna leave it to you guys if y'all want to, or I can explain what both of those concepts are for world building.
Sean looks very excited about this.
Sean does.
I'm so excited because I have such an opinion on this. And I as evinced by Anna, what was it, a year and a half ago, something like that, coming up with an idea for a Dungeons and Dragons game. I love how you preface this with this has a lot to do with gaming. And me coming up with a character based on that. So ran with it and wrote an entire novella and created this entire world of animals that have magical powers but live in our everyday lives. Like they're in a Walmart parking lot and they're casting, fireball at each other. I'd love to come up with a small tidbit and then work outwards from there. So in that case of that particular story, like I didn't know if they were going to be in a separate world, like there's no humans, until I had already written 30,000 words, 20,000 words. So it was just like revealing itself, like as each layer grew from that. And I totally would love, it doesn't have to be next, but Ian's answer, because I'm pretty sure he does it the other way around.
Yeah, so what Sean just described is bottom-up world building, which means you start from like on the ground with that character and then move up to the whole universe.
To be quite honest, Sean, you're actually wrong. I do not approach world building from a top up. I usually approach it from like an idea of like one thing. Which is I think I would call it bottom up because I am very much a story first person. What matters to me more is a character to hook it on, and if I don't have that, I can't really even world build that much. For instance, my web serial was all spawned from one idea, which was what if there was like a clone of Superman just running around trying to hide from the government, not wanting to get involved with stuff. And then a whole world unfurled from that guy.
Yeah. I also tend to start with I've kind of done it both ways. My general tendency is I start with like a specific concept or like one very specific element of my world, and then I build the world out from that. It doesn't necessarily have to be a character, but it could be like an organization of people or a specific scene. Sometimes it starts, I get like a inspiration for a specific scene, and then all the world building kind of comes from that. I don't often do top down in the way that I think we're thinking of top. Like I don't really consider the world building that I do top down, but I think that some people might. Even when I'm starting with broader concepts, I still feel like it's building out from something central instead of building in. I don't know.
I think so. I'm gonna buck expectations because I guess for what I typically what you might consider, but yeah, it seems that I do mostly top down. So top down being starting with a concept, and building toward it. So for Stonehearts, which is the book I'm working on drafting right now, the concept was to have a world where men and women were completely segregated, and everything had to come from that. And so it's all about building, okay, like physically, how do you keep them segregated? How is this city laid out? Like how do you deal with the social implications of only knowing women your whole life, except for maybe your husband or your father. And so in that case, I was doing, yeah, very much a top-down society. I've written other books where the concept was more broad, like let's do a like a sorry. Stars Defied, they have a religion based around astrology. And so everything comes from that. So to answer Shannon's other question, which is better? It depends on what your story is. It depends on what you want to do with it. And it depends on what inspiration strikes you first. Because if the first thing that hits you is this really cool character, then you're going to be doing bottom up. Because you're starting with the details and you're trying to build a larger strategy around them. But if you are maybe more theme based, then if you want your book to have like a true message, then you're probably going to be doing top down.
Yeah, I can see that because I actually just got done reading The Broken Earth, and I would call that a top down because it is very thematic all the way through, and there's an aesthetic that it's adhering to. And I don't think, you know, Anna, you may disagree with me, but having read all three now, I don't think that the character emotional core of it was actually like the first idea, because it really, what became the emotional core of the series didn't emerge until book 2 for me.
Mhm.
Yeah, that
Uh,
makes sense. I agree with that. But actually, like, now that I'm thinking about this, I don't really like the terms top down or bottom up at all. Because that's not the way that I conceptualize world building. It's always building out from something, and it's building out in all directions. It's not going top to bottom or bottom to top. It's
yeah,
like I have an idea and I'm like, you're doing like the mind map thing, right? Where you're building out around it and it's going in every direction, and there's specific either details that you have to come up with. No matter where you start, you're having to build out the details or make something more broad in order to encompass different parts of the world. And so you're not always going from broad to detail or detail to broad. You're kind of doing both all at the same time.
So it's interesting talking about this because we're definitely talking about organic world building right now, right? So you can think of it as like fractals, that people love that, like the snowflake method. Or you could think of it as like moss growing across a tree where it's like whatever's the most fertile, that's where we're following.
yeah,
But there's also a ton of guides, and Shannon, I don't know if I'm stepping on one of your questions, but there's also a ton of guides online where it's like how to do world building, right? Answer these essential questions to make sure that you have a fully fleshed out society, right? So we're going to start with, what does the geography look like? What does their politics look like? What does their education system look like? How are the genders organized? Things like that. And it give you really like there's a lot of stuff. I've tried filling them out sometimes for my own stuff because you know me, I'm spreadsheet oriented. If there's a list to do it, I will do it. But it's too much because for my story, that doesn't matter. It actually doesn't not all of it matters. And so there's always large swaths of it that I can just kind of like ignore. I don't have to put anything in the religion section for Stonehearts because they're an atheistic society. Um,
So I find, regardless of what kind, people who have thought long and hard and spent more than enough time, I'll phrase it that way, on their world building end up suffering from something called world builder's disease in their story, which is they've spent time and they equate the time and effort with quality or requirement. And so then their stories end up with numerous asides to explain things that aren't story relevant.
yeah,
And people get confused about the difference between world building off the page for themselves and world building on the page. And then also confusing that with exposition, because they are inherently different things, even though exposition is the vehicle on which that world building gets on the page for the most part. Sean, you have you have a thought.
Yes, totally. And love Daphne's point. And her talking about the tools, snowflake method and those being good ways to help flesh that out. And that brought something to mind for me, which is limitations. Limitations are always good. And if you place kind of like arbitrary things on that, then you can cut out some of that. You don't need to flesh out everything. And as Shannon said, like you can literally go into a type of paralysis regarding this. So limitations where you're like, I'm only to describe this one island. I'm not going to worry about the rest of the globe. I'm only going to worry about this aspect of society. I'm going to say it's atheistic, and I'm just going to cut that out of my world building so that it doesn't overwhelm me. But then also, Shannon, as you were talking as well, it made me think of Martha Wells, and just one of the best authors at, yeah, the background is massive. The world building behind the page is incredibly large. And then she just drops into a story. Oh, I'm a robot, and in the back of my head, I am watching a 755 episode soap opera about the moon that I have loved for years, and it's a dramatic, over the top, thing, and it comforts me. Whoa, where did this come from? What is the colonization of the moon like at this point? Why are there holodramas that are out there, and how many other long-running series across the universe exist? None of that. That does not touch anything, and that's in sci-fi. Another example as well, in the case of fantasy, is Witch King, where the explanation of the magic is so tiny. It feels like it's rigorous, but she does not explain. The story takes precedent.
I think that that's an interesting line to walk, because you have to know your story and you have to know your readers, because there are readers, and I'm going to think about Anna's least favorite author here, that that readership wants all that world building, right? There's people that read. This is not who I was not talking about J.R.R. Tolkien. J.R.R. Tolkien is your favorite author. There's people who read J.R.R. Tolkien's like encyclopedia of his world building, right? And so the world building, always save all your documents, because maybe one day someone wants an encyclopedia of your world building. But what actually goes in the story needs to only be what's relevant to the story. You're definitely tip of the iceberging this. And so know your story, know your readers, because some readers are going to want a lot more, and some readers are going to want to be very story forward, which is what, like, Nine Fox Gambit has very fascinating world building, but it is only explained in terms of what is relevant to the plot. So there's a lot more out there that we're not seeing, because we're going for just the parts that move the story forward.
I think that's a really good way to describe it. Like, only what needs to be on the page should be on the page. But if you are, in a genre where the world building is delicious, for instance, we've talked about science fiction and fantasy, and I'm fairly certain you're actually talking about Brandon Sanderson, but I could be wrong.
Yeah.
I was, but I didn't want to defame him on screen.
He's doing fine.
He's all right.
Did you know that he actually looks up YouTube videos and watches them fully to make sure was he mentioned, and was it in a positive?
Look, Neil Gaiman haunts Tumblr. Okay, I just know if I ever strike gold and end up on like a panel with this man, I don't want to have to explain that I said that.
Well, I mean, but in a sense, even if it doesn't work for y'all, I mean, he is a guru at this point, right? Like, he gives lectures and stuff on world building, doing it the way he does it. So I think he'll be fine. I've lost my actual plan. Oh, okay. So apologies. But like, one of the things that I think is very interesting about saying like only what needs to be in the story is that what needs to be in the story is different based upon your ideal audience, your ideal reader or your genre. And we've kind of been talking about science fiction, but this also goes into things like romance, which you could speak to, because a lot of times in romance, you have.
I have so much to say about world building for contemporary stories. I'm so excited.
But I mean, like the world, the society, what have you, becomes very important, because these things are oftentimes integral to the conflicts inside of romance, or because more characters and their subsequent books are going to be set in the same exact place. And so you have to have continuity in these things. So it's important for the author to think about them before they get started, because they are essentially characters in themselves. But what I was going to say is, like, one of the things that we're doing in my class right now with the EFA is I went through the world building section, and a lot of the editors actually had a hard time with the homework activity that we did, where I made them go read exploration science fiction to figure out what kind of world building it is. And they had a difficulty with it, because historically, almost all those books are written in an operatic style, where you have a huge cast and everything is explained. You may have one of those like 3-chapter introductions just to get boots on the ground. They're not written like that anymore. So even if the world building is giant, they're written character first. The requirements for the readership have changed over the past 30 years, because people want character-driven stories, even if they're in gigantic universes. So there's still things out there that very clearly are written as gigantic worlds, like excuse me, apologies, like Children of Time is like super big still. It's still in like the top 15 or whatever. And that is definitely written like an old school, like 1990s, 1980s style, like world building first. Let's get into the whatever.
Is something that can be very difficult working with authors who are coming to us. They've been querying and they've been getting a lot of rejections, and trying to explain, like, look, this, you didn't start off with action, you didn't start off with character. And they're like, well, you know, J.R.R. Tolkien didn't do that, or, you know, well, that's not true, but like such and such.
Stephen King doesn't do it that way.
Yeah.
Michael Crichton didn't do it that way.
Big name author, they started off with a ton of exposition, or Asimov's stories, the Foundation series, right? That story's classic. Everyone loves that. And you're like, yeah, but it's not done that way anymore, right? Like it's those are classics, and a lot of people read them because they're classics, but they're not necessarily compelling to an audience the same way that they once were.
Yeah. And so I think that's a big thing to think about when you're doing your own world building, is not so much like, should I do it from one direction to another, but like, what do I think my readership is going to want when this does show up, right? Like, how much explanation do I think I want to do? Am I going to hit this in a magical realism way where it's on the page, but it's never explained? Or am I going to do it old school where I'm going to make an entire chapter around, you know, how the ship engine works? And if I do that, like, will people read it? So.
A million years ago, Anna and I went to a Houston science fiction fantasy meetup. And it must have been critique night or something, because there was a guy there. Anyway, so he was writing science fiction, and he very obviously likes hard science fiction. He wants the tech details and stuff like that. And so they were having a hard time explaining to him that people don't read science fiction to read a manual of your faster than light travel engine. They don't care.
The only book that I have ever DNF'd, I don't DNF as a matter of principle, because I'm stubborn, but the only book I have ever DNF'd was a book by Greg Bear. I don't remember what it was called, but it was very hard sci-fi. And the book was essentially tech manual after tech manual describing the intricate ways that all of these, you know, science fictional machines are built and how they work and what type of energy they run on and all the component parts that are necessary. And I'm like, I cannot read. It was like 1,000 pages. It was so long, such a long book. And I got halfway through and I was like, I can't read this anymore. I can't do it, because the story was just getting completely lost in the, and so like we'd have, you know, 30 pages of description of, you know, this new piece of technology that they're discovering for the first time. And I completely lose the whole thread of the story. And then when we do get back to the story, I don't remember what was happening. So I was like, I can't read. That's the only book I have ever DNF'd.
Susan says he sounds like an adventure. And I do want to say, like, the makeup of the Houston Science Fiction and Fantasy meetup group, which I can talk about now because we run the damn thing, was it was disproportionately, for like the general population, was disproportionately near retirement or retired engineers who had this problem. And we have a lot of, you know, we have a lot of engineers with NASA and everything like that. But they would constantly, it was a consistent issue for them. Like, we're like, but the science is so important. And it was not something that they could easily like distinguish from what the story was. And
that would be such a fun mixed material project, though. Like, Ian loves this shit. Ian loves weird stuff. So, like, if you did a story, but you've got like little pockets in it where you include actual freaking manuals of your tech,
Yeah.
you don't have to read to enjoy the story, but it's in there.
so I want to say one more thing, but I do want to bother Daphne to go into world building for things outside of sci-fi. But one of the other things that has changed is what the makeup of hard science fiction looks like. And what we would have considered hard science fiction years and years and years ago, we would consider soft science fiction now because the science doesn't science. And so even if you spent tons of time explaining your fake science is still so far from what science says is, there's capacity for, it would not be considered hard now. But a person who writes very proficiently in explaining science while still having a full character and have a character focused story is Andy Weir. So in The Martian is completely science, but it's all science relevant to that character's plight and trying to survive on Mars while his technology fails. His most recent book, Project Hail Mary, is very different in how it's told, but it is still a character trying to figure out the science while also having amnesia and dealing with alien species and trying to save the world. There's so much science in it and so much realistic science in it, but it is all based around that character and that character's efforts and their motivations and their goals. So if you are looking to write science fiction with very strong hard science in it, I would, if you haven't for some reason read Andy Weir's books, that is where you need to start with your research. But Daphne.
Definitely.
Sean had relevant stuff to this before we get to me.
Okay.
Please, really quick, just to get back to the DNF, and oh my gosh, there was so much science in there. I have read Werner von Braun's fiction book, which, as you can imagine, because he was the scientist and the originator of NASA, was so technical and just would describe, the astronauts climb down. They put on their helmets. It has a 316 wing nut on the side of it. Again and again and again and again. And my DNF was to skim it and be like, 5 pages. Okay, still the same. Okay, fine.
Yeah.
You're just scanning for the character name to see when he shows back up.
That's what that Greg Bear book was like. And it was like, oh yeah, he tightened up the 3/16, nut. He had to use a specific wrench and blow. I'm like, oh, can't do it. I know some people like that stuff. It is not for me. And being a scientist, coming from a scientific background, man, we got to get these scientist authors, on a more engaging path, because
I have a friend who is an engineer with a firm, and he went back to school for that after originally getting a degree in poetry. And he has been very lucky to keep getting promotions at this job because he's the only of the engineers in the entire firm who can write.
Yeah.
And so they're always like, here, you do this report, you do this presentation, because he is not going to get lost in the sauce.
So communication, scientific communication is a skill that scientists are very lacking in.
My alma mater actually now requires the engineers. So Rice University requires engineers to take a communications course.
That's good.
Yeah.
I think all STEM tracks should require some sort of writing or communications course of their students, because it's such an important skill to be able to communicate ideas effectively in a way that's engaging to other people that so many people in STEM fields just don't have. But this is kind of getting off topic, but it's related. It's related.
It absolutely is, especially if you are writing even a technical magic system requires you to be able to communicate, right? Yeah. If you need an entire chapter to explain the magic system, you do not have a good magic system, or you do not have a writer who's learned to communicate, one or the other. So some of this is just going back to the basics of figuring out how to encode and then make sure that the audience you're speaking for can decode your message. And I'm not trying to be blithe or flippant, but it can be hard. It can be really hard to do this. And a lot of it is just getting back to the mechanics at the line level of how do I say this distinctly? Or how do I put this in a simile or a metaphor so I don't have to do the full, description? Or how do I put this into a scene where the rules become self-evident instead of telling the reader in great detail? And I think that's a little bit different than the world building itself. So I do want to get back to Daphne. I think we will talk about exposition a little bit. I think we may have time. But realistic world, what do we need to do for a realistic world? Why would we have to world build in the real world?
Yeah. So, I mean, even if you're talking about actual real locations. There is still world building involved. So let's say you're making a fictional town, and then we'll talk about real towns after this. But let's say you're making a fictional town. So you need to understand like a basic kind of layout of the town, right? Just for purely practical purposes. If she's going between the grocery store and her house, how far away are those things from each other? Is it walking distance or is she driving a car? Is it something that you're going to encounter dirt roads, or are you going to encounter panhandlers? Are you going to who is she likely to see? What is the makeup of the people in the town? I think people assume that real world building doesn't need to happen because they think everyone has had their same life experiences. And not that they like explicitly think this, but like they assume, right? So I grew up Midwest, suburban, very white area. And so when I write a typical town, that's what I'm going to write for you. I'm going to write Midwest suburbia, despite the fact that that's not really everybody's experience, right? So if you grew up in New York City, then you probably took the subway to get to your school. I took a school bus. And that's going to be very different. You have to take a moment and realize that not everyone's experience was the same as yours. Even if you're talking about suburbia in Texas is very different from suburbia in Missouri. The kinds of things that people wear, how they talk, how they interact with the world, those are all going to be very different. And so I was editing for a client and she had written a typical college. The problem was that without the specific details of where that college is, you can get lost, right? If it's in Florida, you aren't going to have autumn leaves, right? If it's in
Yeah.
Kansas, there's not any mountains nearby for anybody to climb. So you need to be very specific when you're talking about where you want your world to be set. If you're talking about the real world, you really need to pick a place. Even if you're just going to say, okay, well, I don't want it to be a real place, but I want it to be a small town in Kansas. Great. Go look at small towns in Kansas, see what they're like, model it after that. And if you do pick a real place, so I wrote a cozy mystery that was set in Branson, Missouri. And I went and visited Branson, and I went to see where's the police station and where would my character go to the grocery store. And I'm not necessarily putting her at a specific address, but I needed to know what her world looked like so that for people reading this, it wouldn't be jarring.
Yeah, I have a really good example of someone screwing that up, and I've shared this several
Ricky
times, I
Riordan?
think. Yeah, so oh my God, okay. I'm losing my train of thought. But
Oh man, this is
my
making
brain
me-
is completely scrambled. I'm really sorry, y'all.
I'm gonna jump in and hope that you remember, but one of the things
No,
that I think we haven't.
I know what it is.
Okay,
So when you are writing in a real world setting, you have to know, like, you're not building the world from scratch, obviously, but like if you are writing in a town that actually exists, you need to know what that town or city is like. You need to know maps, like study maps, know what it's like.
What do they call their highways?
Yeah, all you need to know all of that stuff. So in The Lightning Thief, one of the first Percy Jackson book, the author, the like climax of that book is set in St. Louis. And it
Inside
centers
the
around,
arch.
yeah, it centers around the St. Louis Arch. And when the author originally wrote this book, he thought the arch went over the Missouri River. It's the Missouri River, right? Whatever river is there.
Mississippi?
He thought it went over the Mississippi.
He thought the
like,
arch went over the
crossed
river.
it.
And he thought the arch crossed the river. And so the whole climax of the book hinged on the water of the river coming up and, doing something with the arch and, blah, 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 whatever. I haven't read the book, but I have read all about this climax of the book.
The character gets blown out of the arch and lands in the river.
Yeah. But
Yeah.
his readers caught him on it because they're like, oh, the arch doesn't go over the river. What are you talking about? And so he came back later and published republished an edited version of the book where he had fixed that mistake. So like if
Yeah.
you are writing in a real world setting, in a real town, a real city, whatever, you need to know about that place because your readers will catch you.
And in a world where Google Maps and Google Street View and just the internet in general exists, you really don't have an excuse.
Yeah, you don't have to
Not
travel
do
to that place.
You don't
Yeah.
have to go to like Bolivia in order to write about Bolivia. It would help, and I would take that vacation in a heartbeat. But like, you can
research.
still look stuff up.
Yeah.
So one of the other things that we haven't actually talked about, but that is really important with the details that you make it on the stage, on the page, excuse me, stage, is that even if you aren't a visual reader, which I think about 25% of us are not visualizers, I am not. Even if you are not, the majority of people out there visualize as they read. They create a mental image based upon the context and then the actual like visual cues that you put into in that story. So if somebody is reading your story and the visual context veers significantly different from what they have visualized based upon the other information that you've already given them, it pulls them out of the story in a much more like distinct way than you may realize. They lose the visual image that they have that provides them with this like theater of the mind they're creating from reading your book. So if you either don't have visuals and they're, you know, working in a blank room, or if your visuals don't match, like your detail visuals don't match themselves, this creates another way for the reader to go, maybe I don't need to go back to that book. You know?
It was wild to me when I found out that not everyone visualizes stuff when they're reading, because that's such an important part of it for me. But I am terrible about room details. I am definitely talking heads in a blank space on my first draft. I'm getting better. But what my biggest pet peeve in reading is when an author goes too long without describing what a character looks like. Because I've already filled them in, like almost immediately I've filled them in. So if you come back later and suddenly she has red hair, I'm gonna lose it.
Just out of curiosity, everybody else on the panel, are you visualizers?
Yes.
Sean, Ian?
I'm somewhere in between, I feel like sometimes.
What do you mean by visualizer?
Do you
I
see?
do not see anything when I read.
Yeah.
There
I
is
see.
a third space in my brain where things happen without our five senses
No,
that
I
I
watch
do
mo-
not
I-
have the vernacular to describe. I do
Yeah,
not see it though.
Yeah, so
I watch movies.
But
When I
yeah,
read, I
exactly.
watch movies.
I lose complete track of the fact that I'm reading words at all. It's just
Yeah.
visual.
Yeah,
And-
I'll start to visualize.
And
Yeah.
yeah, for me, the visualization, the vividness of the visualization depends on the book. So like some books I don't visualize as strongly. And what I have noticed is it simply has to do with like the style and the way that the author describes the setting and the characters. And if the author is a little bit more bland with how they describe the characters, then my mental image of the book is going to be a little bit more bland. I get really lost in books that have very vivid descriptions. I completely dissociate from my body while I'm reading those. But other books, I don't have that experience as much. So, and it really just depends on the style of the writing.
If the book's bad, I'm not visualizing nothing.
Yeah, for me, it doesn't have to do with whether it's bad or good. It's just the style.
That's funny because I feel like I have the opposite thing where if someone is too descriptive, my brain goes into overload and just only certain details are going to make it through.
Yeah.
I am visualizing very vividly, but it's probably not what they're describing.
So this brings us in, unless Sean, if you had something, I didn't want to interrupt you. Okay.
Real quick, just because I'm reading this Empire of Silence by Christopher. Oh my God, the sticker is on top of it. Ruokio, who I'm going to interview at Comicpalooza coming up June 20th, give or take, right around the 20th. But his books are nice and thick. This is one of those examples of very hard sci-fi, although I would definitely call this science fantasy. That goes into great detail about things and does have some of those asides that go there. It's meant for a reader that is not a general reader. Those people who are looking for, you know, the retired engineers out there. And it's a style. It's just that there is a market for that. So whatever we're saying about the ideal way to do things, you can get published and can figure things out, by just hitting that niche for sure.
Yeah. I mean, Brandon Sanderson's appeal is such that, there are people that are really invested in his magic systeming, and like they are, that's what they're there for. They're there for what's the unique, clever kind of RPG-esque thing that he's done this time.
I'm gonna plug for not for something specific, but if you love world building and you don't care so much about characters or plot, consider making a role-playing game.
Yeah.
So I'm going to shift gears. So we talked a little bit already about, ways that you make sure that you're dropping the world building details. And we basically came across like only what's necessary for the story, but what that means is going to vary by audience and by genre. But what are some other tactics at the line level that you can use to build the world without overloading the reader?
Slang is probably my favorite one. I think I always, when I'm working with my stories, always think of swearing and slang, because so much of English, at least, is Christian based, right? Or Judeo-Christian based, where you're talking about, oh my God, right? So in a character that doesn't have gods, how do you deal with that? How do you deal with the word damn if you don't have a concept of damnation? And so those are really great opportunities to add in a little flavor flav,
Yeah.
in terms of sprinkling in your world building.
Yeah, there's a right way and there's a wrong way to do that with so I'll say the wrong way, and this is I love the Wheel of Time, but the Wheel of Time's just most generic, like ashes and blood, and like just the most generic like thing they could come up with to like fill in that slot of curse words. But then you also had and again I'm plugging the Stone Sky because I just finished it, or the Broken Earth trilogy. But they say earth fires and evil earth and stuff like that. And that's immediately evocative, especially evil earth. How often do you one thing, how often is it that the personification of earth is considered evil and like the general zeitgeist of culture?
Well, and it's also like the good thing about that is those are also like related to the plot of the book.
Oh yeah. It all ties in together. It's really nice.
I am gonna put one layer below purely generic, which is the made up words. If you create like slurg and like Firefly is the only one that did it well because they used Chinese curse words. But if
they didn't make it up.
But they didn't make it up.
They didn't make it up. But they managed to make that one good. But yeah, if you make up curse words, you lose like at least a star on my rating system.
I definitely don't enjoy it. Like that was the one thing that every time it came up in the Wheel of Time, I was like rolling my eyes where they were just like saying. But then they also had Wheel of Time also has one of my favorite things where of world building, which is that everyone in the world thinks peaches are poisonous. And at one point, there's like a thing where like someone offers him a peach and he thinks they're like cursing him or something like that.
I don't know. That's kind of weird to me, but
it's fun. Like that's the kind of stuff that I think is fun world building. And then there's like, Yarslore by the boobs of Bloshberg.
But why do they think peaches are poisonous? What's the point?
I don't remember. To be honest, it's been so long. I don't remember. I think it was
the true tip though that I've heard is only go 2 levels deep on your world building.
Yeah.
No one goes in the sewers at night because no one goes in the sewers at night. That's your thought. Why not? Because there's alligators in the sewers. Why are there alligators in the sewers? Because the nuns are feeding them, right? And you don't have to go past that.
Yeah.
You only need to go so far.
Right.
Usually the reasoning is circular from there.
That's the thing is like for me to enjoy a world building gag like peaches are poisonous, I need to know why these people think that. There needs to be some sort of lore reason, like maybe some god got poisoned with a peach in their mythology or whatever. And so peaches are anathema and they think they're all poisonous. Like, I need to know why. Otherwise, it's just like, this is weird. Why do they think peaches are poisonous?
You
Okay,
and
so
the
I looked it up because
million.
we've gotten too close to these peaches, but it's because the amount of cyanide in them in the evil world is different. But everybody believes the peaches are like
Yeah.
naturally trying to poison you with cyanide.
Oh, okay.
Apparently, it was a real world reasoning. The Robert Jordan did not like peaches.
Okay, whatever.
So I'm glad that Daphne brought up like the 2 layers deep. I mean, I suppose you could go 3 layers, but the point is to like stop yourself from overdoing the world building.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I have
Yeah.
a couple of things that I generally say to look out for, because we're going to bloviate a little bit. We're allowed to bloviate a little bit. So if you're writing something that's contemporary or it's set in the real world, urban fantasy, or paranormal romance or something, you can give yourself roughly 200 words of explanation here and there. Once you get more than that, you need to really look close at your exposition and decide if this shit fits.
Yeah.
If it's a harder or an off-world situation, you can give yourself up to 300 before you need to start scrutinizing that work and see if it needs to be broken up. So, like, to me, that is a hard and fast rule for when you go back to re-edit your stuff. Because your first draft should be whatever your first draft is. You start policing your first draft too much, it won't get written. Second and third draft, you can start really looking in there. Another thing that I really like authors to do, especially when they have a hard time, if they have not world built enough, this is where it normally comes down, is they world build in the wrong directions for their stories that are character driven. They don't know who the saddest person in society is. Who is at the bottom?
Yeah.
If you can define who's at the bottom, you can define what it means to be at the top and why that person at the top is different and how they got there. So I love that as a very character focused way to build your world. It's also a great way to figure out when you're going to have the pet the dog moment, if your character does do that to prove they're good, especially if they're kind of an asshole at the beginning, like your protagonist, which a lot of us love anti-heroes. Who are they petting? What does the dog look like, right? And usually it's the person who has no control, who is actively dying in some way or other, and no one else will help them. So what does that character look like? So those are my 2 biggest tips, but I'm sure you guys have other ones too.
I don't know if this, I guess this counts as a tactic. So kind of my favorite tool for getting the world building details into the story is weaving them into the story as you go. And we call that incluing, where the goal is not to pause the story to explain something about the world. The goal is for the story to keep moving forward while you're weaving in the relevant details about the story. And I know, Shannon, you said that, generally people can have, I guess in my genre, in science fiction and fantasy, people can generally have up to 300 words of exposition sprinkled in here and there. I don't like to do that at all. Anytime I find myself writing or reading something that's just like an aside that feels like it's a paragraph and it's like an explanation of something, even if it's like something relevant to the scene, right? Where like something came up in the scene that, we haven't really seen in the world building before. So now here we're going to take a few sentences and it's really short and we're just going to very briefly explain what it is. And then we're going to keep going. I don't like writing that. And I also don't like reading it. And I know, like, even if it fits in that 300 word limit, for me, it just completely interrupts the flow of the story. And so I am a very big proponent of like spreading all of that detail and explanation around. And I hate to say it because we've roasted this piece of advice, showing rather than telling. Because to me, like those little small blocks of exposition feels like telling rather than, it's like, show me what this thing is. Don't take a paragraph to explain this little concept that you've just introduced. Show me what the concept is by having it in action in the in the story. But now I will say my first drafts do sometimes have those little blocks of exposition. But when I go through and do my self edits, by the time I get to the second and third and fourth draft, they're gone.
So I'm going to counter you, but this is like a second or third level kind of thing. Exposition can work in big sections if it has hooks. And so sometimes you don't realize you're reading the exposition because there are hooks, but there are a number of things that you like that have a lot of exposition, but you don't realize it because it's hooky. So like, was it the long trip to a small angry planet? Like not the very first, but the second chapter is exposition for over 500 words.
Yeah.
Over 500 words.
Yeah.
If I remember correctly, it's like 869. I had to. I promise you there's a reason. I counted every single one of them. That was exposition. But I mean, that's neither here nor there. Like that is much higher level. But in general, I agree with you. Inkling is a really big thing. Does anybody else have any other tips?
I thought of one. And I don't know how much I advocate for this, but it is definitely a popular way of doing it. So particularly popular if you are writing YA, which is having your character learn about the world alongside your reader. And so this is going to be with your isekai, which everyone knows is my favorite, with your isekai stories or your fish out of water stories. In YA, it could be, oh, I've been kidnapped by a vampire prince and now I must learn about vampire society, right? And so she's learning about it and so are you. So that's the way that the author is able to get past the exposition rules, is because, well, someone has to explain it to her. She doesn't know. Not my favorite, but it is an absolutely valid and well-used tip.
Ian, Sean, do y'all have ones to add?
Love the including, and as Daphne said, you know, and my tip is going to be anything that you excise. You know, if you're taking it out, trying to make your story better, and you have put too much world building or exposition in, save that, and you know it might come up later. Another example as well. I just did a talk about book middles, and in that was talking about like, where do you start the story or where do you end it? And maybe you want to start late or end early, you know, just shifting where that is. So the thought of taking the first 3 chapters of your book out is horrendous to some people, but at the same time, yes, all prologues are gone, Anna.
Oh, it hurt me so much the first time I did it. It hurt me so much to do it, and it made my story a million times better. It was
figuring
such a good
out where the beginning is.
The prologue doesn't count in those first 3 chapters that you cut out, because the prologue is separate.
Okay, so
we can't argue about prologues. We've done that for a whole.
No, we've done that before. So the point being, whether you're pulling out paragraphs or you're pulling out whole chapters, these are things that are very useful that might come back later. You might use a conversation somewhere else. You might use some of that world building that you put in there that you took out somewhere else, or even in the case of like whole things, those are bonus chapters. So those are things that you can sell, you know, and try and get published as standalones. Save all of those things. So if you notice that you're world building too much, none of that work is for nothing. It's all worthwhile. It's just that you might end up using it in a different way than in your manuscript, straightforward.
Yeah.
We got about 2 minutes left. Ian, if you don't have anything you want to add, I have one other question that I always love giving us ones where we make ourselves look bad right before we have to leave.
Okay.
What world building mistakes have you made? And then how did you learn from them?
There are no mistakes, only happy accidents.
What happy accidents taught you?
Okay.
Oh no,
I did a world that was.
Mistakes.
I have one.
I think my biggest offense, and I have done this. It usually becomes a problem when I'm writing a short story, so a very small story. When I am trying to tell 2 stories at once, or I have incorporated not necessarily conflicting world building elements, but world building elements that don't really fit together over the course of a small story. Whereas like over a novel length, those world building elements might be okay because we would have the words to fully explore both of those elements. But in a short story, there is not the space to fully explore two kind of separate world building elements. And so usually, if I give that story a break and I just don't look at it for a while, I can come back and say, oh, this one can just completely lift out and the story will be a lot tighter and it won't really change the actual plot or the character arcs that much. And so that's when I know I've made that kind of blunder. So
I think
for me, that's my thing is I'm trying to do
hmm,
too much in too much in too short of a story.
I think my biggest mistake has been doing something that is too like derivative or relies on too many common elements of a world building project, like borrows too much from like the standard language without trying to add anything new or consider some of the unique applications of a world building idea that you're doing.
In order to talk about futuristic food, I wrote a 3,000 word dinner that had 7 courses. That was a mistake. That was absolutely a mistake. And how did I fix it? I think was part of Shannon's answer. In that particular story, just used one of the courses and left it at that amount of, exposition explaining about this, a couple of dishes on the plate.
Yeah.
I did then have the ability to use that other parts of that dinner in another work as well.
What's good about that is you wrote 7 courses and you picked the best one for your story.
Yes, I love that too.
Yeah, reframe it more positively.
Mm-hmm.
I fall down rabbit holes of asking myself questions about cultures, be like, well, why do we do this? Why do we do this? And trying so hard to get away from typical Western culture when creating a new culture that it becomes unintelligible. And so it'll start off with things like, well, not everyone's gonna like walk their bride down the aisle. They're not all gonna wear rings. Obviously, they're not gonna use white dresses. And it ends with things like creating a society where there are no last names. And it became very difficult to deal with, both as a reader and as a writer. And so in trying to be anti-cliche, I create something that is too difficult to understand.
So how did she fix it?
I haven't yet. I'm still working on it.
Still figuring that one out.
If it does, what I'm gonna do is, if it doesn't further my story, then I'm just gonna have to cut it and just kill my darlings.
For me, one of my baby writer mistakes was thinking I was writing action so that I could add world building. But what I was really doing was like writing somebody sort of wandering around a room and then like thinking and basically world building through their thoughts or exposition or memories. I went back and read, the very first book I wrote after becoming an adult because my teenage ones don't count. And there's one there's one chapter where the main character essentially walks across a roof. That is the only action in the entire 3,500 word chapter. And the rest of it is just stuff she's seeing around her, which if it was like interesting stuff, you could get away with a little bit of it. But it was mostly like, this is what this valley looks like. So one of the things that I realized that I needed to do, because like just by nature, my brain is not good at necessarily like recognizing that stuff, is that I have to either, before I write the chapter, write down what the action beats of that chapter are, or when I go back to scrutinize what I've written, figure out, like analyze what change has actually occurred here, and then like cull the stuff that doesn't help that change. So it's hard, to evaluate your own work, but it's certainly great to do so. Because if I was still in the same place I was when I first started, because I was afraid to actually look and, be critical of my own work, I would probably still be, writing chapters. I'm like, why doesn't anybody want to read about this person going on a grocery trip? Nothing happens, but they got milk on sale, like. So that's my things. Does anybody have any other questions before we go? Going once, going twice. Sean, why don't you tell everybody what we're going to be doing over the course of like the next week to month? You've got a lot of things coming up for Right Space that we're
I've got a
engaging
lot of things coming up on my for sure, and happy to be including on my Tomeworks in some of the events. As we had mentioned earlier, my Writers Family Reunion is going to be happening May 1st through 4th, and I'll toss that in the chat. You can always search up Writers Family Reunion on Eventbrite and find us there. But Tomeworks is going to be doing writerly games at Axelrad on Friday night. After we have a couple talks at Kindred Stories over in the 3rd Ward. And really, this is just for aspiring writers. You know, do you want to meet other writers in Houston, do some activities, maybe try and set up a critique group with people who are like-minded? We're also going to kick off the Writers Family Reunion on Thursday with a writer's lunch that is a bookseller AMA. So I have 3 different booksellers from my Houston bookstores. What do you want to know about what they think about books that come into their store, about how to sell books, about how different authors approach, how can I get my book in your bookstore? Let's answer some questions and see how the attitude is with boots on the ground.
For the other things we're doing, because we always do writers lunch on Thursdays. So for sure, you can find us on Meetup, you can find us on Eventbrite. We're phasing out Facebook, but we do that every Thursday. If you'd like to follow, on the 17th of May, we'll have another one of these editor AMAs. If you have questions you would like us to address, by all means, join our Discord. I hope one of the other people on here could add the Discord link, because I am too far away from it. But you can join our Discord and ask questions there. You can join our Patreon and get preferential treatment for your questions. The other thing we're going to be doing at the end of May, so like roughly 3.5 weeks from now, is almost all of us are going to be speakers or presenting at WizCon, which is the largest feminist science fiction convention. It's online. Tickets are not very expensive because they want to make sure that it's equitable and that people can access us. But I know at least 3 of us are there. So you may want to see about it yourself and join in the learning from all the panels and the community that you can find through WizCon. And that's all I can think of right now, but there may be some more things we're doing.
Also, some of us are going to be doing Right Hive.
Yeah, Right Hive.
I believe that's going to be airing in July.
Yeah, and Comic Palooza's in June. We're going to be there too.
Yeah, those are still a few. Those are still a few months away. So
Yeah.
I'm just like
We don't
focus
have
on.
the full panel schedule for Comic Palooza yet, but
Yeah. So we'll be doing stuff along with our normal editing grind, which we love. But we hope to see you at some of these things. Come say hi. We don't bite.
Thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you, everybody. We'll see you next time. Bye.
Thanks, y'all.